You know, I ought to tell the truth. Wait, check that. I morally ought to tell the truth. What just happened? I inserted the word morally, and the meaning of my sentence changed. If we can tell more or less how the meaning of my sentence changed, then we've learned something about what we are studying when we study morality or ethics. And when we try to answer that question, we are doing meta-ethics. We're inquiring into what ethics is about. We're coming to an agreement at the beginning of our conversation about our shared understandings. Here is how I suggest the meaning of my sentence changed. Initially, I could have merely meant that it's hard for me to remember my lies, and it's embarrassing when I'm found out. So honesty is the best policy. I ought to be honest. Fair enough. But when I introduce the language of morality, I raise the stakes. Even if I am saying what I morally ought to do, I'm suggesting that I may be applying it to you too, and for that matter, to everybody else. I'm saying something relevant to all of humankind. So we can see that morality is about the bigger picture. It's about how I shall live my life when I think of myself not just as an isolated individual, but as a useful member of humankind. For our purposes, we can sort humankind into three circles. The broadest is the circle of all humankind. Our effect upon that circle morally matters, even though most of its members are nameless dots to us. Then there's a smaller circle, the circle of our community, within which we have concrete relationships and defined expectations. These two circles, call them the us circles, are not the entirety of ethics, however. There is also the smallest circle, which has one member, me. I have practiced prodigiously to benefit the me circle. And this is not really morally wrong. If I wish to benefit humankind, I'm a member of this group too, and as the flight attendant always says, if you have small children with you, always put on your own oxygen mask first. You cannot be useful to others if you are no longer breathing. Our meta-ethics, then, what our course is about, is the ideal of living a life that benefits all three human circles. It's easy to jump to the conclusion that in order to get from here to there, to that ideal, we need to find an absolute moral standard. Perhaps this standard, what we will call the final factor, is conscience, or a deity, or maybe reason. If there is such a final factor, then this would be convenient, since it could presumably generate a code or a formula to guide us. This part of moral philosophy, since it involves discovering moral criteria or rules or norms, is called normative ethics. It turns out to be harder than you think to find such a final factor. Why? I can only come up with two ways of discovering it: by examining the world around us or by examining our minds. Take the first way. When we examine the world around us with our five senses, we're only going to discover the way the world is. It is what it is. If what the world is differs from what it ought to be, then it's not what it ought to be. But if we're examining what it is, where are we going to look to discover what it ought to be? Not in the world that we examine with our senses. As the philosopher David Hume famously noted, you can't get an ought from an is. So let's try the second way. Maybe we could discover it not by sense experience, but by looking within. I look at the world, I see someone causing suffering, and I say, see that cruelty. It's morally wrong. I see the suffering, and I add its moral wrongness. I look within and find that prior belief about the way the world ought to be. Now that's great, nobody disagrees, but this can very quickly spin out of control. There may be many other things that I find equally morally repulsive, say burning a holy book, or abortion, or capital punishment, to which you have no moral objection. Finding the answer within begins to look arbitrary, as if it is nothing more than personal preference or cultural conditioning. So we start off facing a challenge. After doing meta-ethics this week, we spent each of the next 7 weeks mainly on normative ethics, that is, the search for norms, looking at one big candidate each week for the final factor. It's a fascinating survey, taking us around the world and across the centuries. We consider culture, which initially forms us and is essential to our sense of self. We look at transcendence, which raises our sights to the divine, or at least to things that elevate us above our mundane existence. We explore nature to discover how to be all that we naturally can be. And then there's pleasure, everybody's favorite, and rationality, the philosopher's favorite. We then look at caring, which feminists have highlighted as the most powerful driver of moral relationships. And we conclude with a happy ending, with happiness. But here I am warning you in advance that none of them may succeed. Does that mean that I'm sending you off as a brave warrior into certain defeat? No. Fortunately, we can make moral judgments anyhow. Each of these factors is profoundly valuable as long as it's not pushed too far. We can draw on all of them, not for formulas, but for how they can helpfully promote the ideal of living our lives as useful members of humankind. Finding ways to live in a way that's beneficial to me, to my community, and to humankind. That ideal, going around in all three human circles, is our big idea for week 1.